So listen, good afternoon everybody, and you're all very welcome. I'm delighted to welcome my colleague Dr Ross Mittiga. He's an assistant professor of clinical theory at the Catholic University in Chile's Institute of Political Science. And he's been hosted today by the Centre for Sustainability, Equality and Climate Action, where he's going to be visiting Belfast for the next couple of days. So for the first time in Ireland, welcome to Ireland. Ross's main areas of research on the issue of environmental political theory, the intersection of environmental politics and practice. And in particular, he's going to be very pertinent to the talk he's giving today. Also, there's an associated talk happening tomorrow evening as well. People are interested at 7 o'clock. Is on this issue of the climate catastrophe. And I know for those of you who've been students of mine, that's something we discuss. You can call it climate change, climate catastrophe, climate, breakdown. Is it, as George Monbiot says, calling it climate change is like calling an invading army unwelcome guests? On the other side, then, is that too scaremongering for people? So that's something we can get into. Where Ross is working at the area, a bit like myself, for many of you in the room, people doing PhDs, of the intersection between academic theory and activism and knowledge. So that idea of bringing academic ideas to practice. And in particular, it can raise troubling issues, and Ross, and I'll give an indication of some of Ross's other work that we give the context for his talk. Can we begin to see political and ethical justifications, or even justifications based upon human survivability for climate emergency powers for the state, for example? In the same way we've seen in the pandemic, we had a clear and present danger, and the state took unprecedented action in terms of furloughing workers, restrictions on our movements, in particular, the revelation for me of the key economy, the core economy. And guess what? I don't figure in it. It's my brother who's a busman in Dublin. He's a core worker, not a professor. So it's an interesting moment there. We had, is the pandemic in a way a harbinger of some of the more climate emergency type responses we may see in the future, because things are getting worse. I've done 3 radio interviews today, and I feel like Dr. Doom in reminding people of why Ross's talk in a way is so pertinent. We've had 3 decades of these COPs, Conference of the Parties. So the latest one is in Sharm el-Sheikh. We had Glasgow last year. So as it says, we've had 26 other COPs. And I'm here to tell you that the science is pretty stark. The last 3 decades have seen more than half of all greenhouse gas emissions have been pumped up while we've had these COPs. So on the one hand, you can say, WTF, get rid of them, need something else, or what do we need to do to radicalize them, to make them, deliver. But it is a startling reminder that we could be the first species to accurately document our own demise. We're patiently documenting all the problems, and yet we're not seeing any action. And this is by way of contextualizing what I find interesting about Ross's work, is that as that crisis increases and we begin to see more and more, perhaps even new intersecting calamities, there's going to be a food crisis, because as the climate gets destabilized, the growing seasons are interrupted. Even the modest wildfires we've seen in Italy and Portugal and Spain, that's already impacted on wheat and rice production and so on. So we're already seeing how the climate crisis is intersecting, obviously, with the food issue. There are a serious problems with water that we need to also factor in. I mean, some people think that the Third World War could be around water, not around oil, for example. So anyway, it is about not trying to depress you. The weather enough will do that. But it is to say, let's be honest about where we're at. And in the words of this middle organisation, Extinction Rebellion, let's tell the truth. Things are not going in the right direction. But in the context of what Ross will talk to us about, in terms of how do we justify those emergency powers? Is it by a local state, the nation state? Does that mean we have to temporarily reduce some of our freedoms before all the liberals lose their shit? Some of those freedoms might be not your fundamental political liberties, but maybe some conveniences. No, you can't fly to New York for a hen party, and so on. And now that will cause a wailing and gnashing of teeth And it is a diminution of one understanding of freedom, but in terms of priorities, the fact is that you still have habeas corpus, you can still vote in elections, you're still living in a free society. Those reductions or transformations of our consumer lives, I think they are more legitimate and probably politically compatible with still living in a free society. And just to give you a sense of where Ross's ideas have been coming from the last couple of years, based on his PhD thesis, he has articles entitled "Political Legitimacy, Authoritarianism, and Climate Change" in that radical left-wing journal, the American Political Science Review. No, it's not one of the most, it's prestigious, but it certainly wouldn't be known so well done for getting something into that journal. But he's also had an article published in Philosophical Studies entitled "Material Scarcity and Scalar Justice." So that issue of scarcity, the climate crisis, what does that mean for distributive, procedural, and other forms of justice? And then of particular interest to me is an article from 2019 in Social Theory and Practice. What's the problem with geoengineering? These go-to tech solutions that we see more and more being promoted. And just to give an example of why I encourage you to go and read Ross's work, is that the International Energy Agency, so that's the world's main body looking at the energy transition from coal, oil and gas to renewables, and to reach, the holy grail now of net zero by 2050. And it's rather frightening, and it didn't really get the publicity it deserved. If you look at their modelling of how we're going to get to net zero by 2050, they are open in saying that between 40 and 50% of the reductions are based on as yet developed technologies. So they are modelling globally going to get to net zero by 2050 on the basis of things like geoengineering, carbon capture and sequestration. And that to me should make us very, very scared, because none of us are, Luddites, although the Luddites get a bad rap. They were workers displaced with no sense of anything else than smashing up the machines that are displacing them. But technology is going to be needed. But I think we should all be very concerned when serious organisations, like the IEA, then it's taken up by the UN system, where we just assume these technologies are going to emerge. To me, that's mythic thinking. That's dangerous mythic thinking. And yet it's paraded as serious science-based ways of dealing with the problem. So in all of those, I think it's led Ross to what I think is one of the best named books I've come across in a long time. So Ross has just submitted to Oxford University Press, I presume it'll be out sometime in 2023, his book entitled, or at least provisionally, we're in a bit of a discussion with the publishers maybe about the title, but provisionally it's entitled "Before Collapse, Climate Change as Political Catastrophe." And Ross's talk today is on disobedience in a climate of necessity. So please join me in giving Ross a warm Belfast welcome. So,
especially thank you to those of you who read the paper. I'm sorry for that abusively long paper. I have to say, this is a real honor for me to be here. John, I don't think you're aware of this, but this is the first time I've been invited, kind of flown out to give a talk. So this is really an important moment for me. I really appreciate being here. So as John said, the paper I'm going to be talking about today is Disobedience in a Climate of Necessity. This is actually a chapter in the book manuscript, but this is something I first wrote a couple years ago, and then over the summer I decided just to kind of set fire to it. I rewrote the whole thing, and then in kind of suicidal moment, about a month and a half before the book was due, I decided to burn about 90% of it and start again. So this is actually very new material for me. Only the second time I'll be discussing this. The first time was just about a week and a half ago in Graz, where in Austria, where I am right now, for a few months. So to get started, I just want to start with a story. Let's see if this works. Yeah, okay, here we go. So imagine this, if you will. It's a cloudless mid-May morning, 2014. Jay O'Hara, a Quaker from Cape Cod, and Ken Ward, the older guy here, who was then deputy director of Greenpeace USA, and he was also the president of the National Environmental Law Center. Both of these guys got together and they prayed before they boarded their 32-foot recycled lobster boat, which they called the Henry David T. And they took that boat and they navigated to the middle of a busy coal shipping lane near Brayton Point in the Massachusetts Bay. Now, after they dropped their anchor, Ward and O'Hara, they called up the local Somerset police and they said, we're going to be blocking a ship called the Energy Enterprise. That's going to have 40,000 tons of Appalachian coal on it. That's the boat. Now, once that big boat entered the bay, its crew, the captain, they hailed the Henry David T. and they demanded they get out of the way. Ward and O'Hara, of course, they refused, at which point the Energy Enterprise's frustrated captain grabbed the radio, imagine fist shaking in air, said, but this is American coal. Now, surprisingly, that invocation of patriotism did not compel the two activists to step aside. Rather, they remained right as they were, blocking the way. Now, about 5 hours later, U.S. Coast Guard boarded the Henry David T., arrested both of these guys. But the whole affair made it so the Enterprise was not able to dock for the remainder of the day, which was actually a quite costly delay for them. Now, criminal charges were later filed against O'Hara and Ward, but in a kind of dramatic moment later that year, the prosecuting attorney brought them out on the steps of the courthouse and said, climate change is a disaster. We need to take it seriously. I'm going to drop all charges against them. Ward and O'Hara actually were not happy about that outcome. I'll explain why later. But I believe that this case, the lobster boat case, is representative of an important strain of climate disobedience, which is what I'm going to be talking to you all about today. Now, there are other examples that might be more familiar to you now. There's the Ende Gelände activists rushing into coal fields to shut down extraction. They'll just hundreds of them walk right into coal fields in Germany, shut down machines until just hordes of police come and drag them away. We got Extinction Rebellion blocking busy motorways. I really like these guys. The Just Stop Oil disobedience blocking fuel shipments, construction of new fossil fuel infrastructure. The valve turners in the United States, that's what we called them afterward after a big New York Times article, who shut down tar sands pipelines between the United States and Canada in 5 states simultaneously. Basically, 50% of all oil shipments for that day were stopped. Or just 2 days ago, there were hundreds of Extinction Rebellion activists who ran into the jetways of Amsterdam's biggest airport to prevent private jets from taking off. Got a lot of attention. Now, there's a number of reasons why we should more carefully examine cases like these. The first, probably the most basic one, is that climate-related disobedience has just exploded in scale and frequency over the last 10 years. Obviously, there was a little bit of a lull with the pandemic, but it's picking back up. And in this, it's come to play an increasingly salient role in public conversations and governmental decision-making about climate change. In this sense, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that truly understanding contemporary climate politics requires taking climate disobedience seriously. And I think that's a really welcome development. Now, a second, I guess, more academic reason to take this strain of climate disobedience seriously, or climate disobedience in general, really, is that despite its political and I'll argue later, legal significance, climate disobedience has largely been just ignored by political scientists and philosophers. Not so much by legal studies people, interestingly. Now, I think that's pretty surprising, given that climate disobedience sits squarely at the intersection of the enormous and ever-expanding literatures that we have on political disobedience and climate ethics. Just nobody really puts those two together. It started to change in the last couple of years, but there's still really little work here. Now, subjecting climate disobedience to critical analysis is not, just conceptually valuable for filling that hole in the literature, however. Rather, I'll be arguing this, I think climate disobedience, or at least climate disobedience in the mold of the lobster boat case, presents a significant challenge to prevailing theories of civil disobedience. In other words, this is not just a case of applying our existing categories and concepts to the case of climate disobedience, but using climate disobedience to think more critically about where our existing categories and concepts fall short. Now, for me, the most significant issue concerns the ends of disobedience. Now, notably, for all the debate, the disagreement, and the civil disobedience literature, and there is a lot, there exists a virtually universal consensus. Hardly ever exists in political theory, right? There's a nearly universal consensus that civil disobedience is fundamentally a communicative act. Now, according to this consensus view, the basic goal in undertaking a disobedient action is to express one's moral convictions, to expose and condemn injustice, and to persuade the broader community to join the opposition. So on this view, civil disobedience are essentially actors who are using their illegal action to speak to an audience composed of their fellow citizens. Now, surely, in many cases, the climate disobedience fit this mold. The central argument of my paper is that others, like the lobster boat case, do not. They're not, at least primarily, communicative. Rather, as the climate disobedience involved have themselves repeatedly insisted, the real end of their action is the prevention of harm, and above all, the very great harm of climate catastrophe. Now, if this is right, that is, if some acts of civil disobedience are not communicative but harm preventative, then it would appear that the consensus view has missed something critical. Now, a lot of the paper is devoted to drawing out this distinction between communicative and harm preventative civil disobedience, and I'm not going to mention every point here. But one critical, if a little subtle, difference is the way in which each instrumentalizes the penal process. Now, a common view in the literature is that while voluntarily accepting punishment may not be an essential feature of civil disobedience, so maybe it's not necessary to voluntarily accept civil disobedience for it to be civil disobedience, many maintain nonetheless that voluntarily accepting punishment can be a strategically valuable way of furthering the communicative ends of the protest, which again, civil disobedience are always, almost always assumed to have. So Dr. Ross, for instance, argues that disobedience need not regard their punishment as morally right, but they should accept that when they challenge particular laws or practices, they, quote, must pay a certain price to convince others that their actions have a sufficient moral basis on the political convictions of the community. Martin Luther King, in his letter from Birmingham jail, similarly argues that willingly accepting the penalty of civil disobedience can, quote, arouse the conscience of the community while expressing the very highest respect for the law. In other words, for King, accepting punishment is a means by which activists can exploit the destructive moral tension that arises when a just person is punished for violating an unjust law. Nobody likes to see good people be punished for contesting injustice. And forcing the community to confront that tension, King believes, can generate sympathy for disobedience, by extension, their protest. And that might help persuade other people to join the opposition. Now, of course, this strategic logic breaks down when the aim of disobedience is not communication, but the prevention of harm. Given this, we might expect that climate disobedience would try more typically to evade punishment. And in some sense, I think that is actually often the case. In particular, when faced with criminal charges, many plead guilty on the grounds that they only acted out of necessity. Yet, paradoxically, many of those same disobedience also report themselves to the authorities, like in the lobster boat case, and patiently await arrest. And some have described prosecutors dropping charges against them as disappointing. This is Emily Johnston from the Valve Turners. So, and as she says, I'm happy that the Minnesota court realized that we didn't damage critical infrastructure, because that was a felony. They could have gone to jail for many years for that. But we didn't, we're disappointed we didn't get the trial that we hoped for. What does that mean? She got added punishment. What if they simply wish to avoid punishment? What explains this? Why be disappointed if the aim was just to get out of jail? Well, the key to resolving the paradox, I think, is to understand that while these climate disobedience are not instrumentalizing punishment, they are nonetheless instrumentalizing the penal process precisely by seeking arrest and pleading necessity. Because when this so-called necessity defense works, in the UK, I think it's more frequently called the lawful excuse defense. When this succeeds, it serves to establish a legal precedent for regarding that and similar acts of disobedience as excusable responses to climate harms and to the broader threat of climate catastrophe. And this, in turn, can have the effect of emboldening others to take similar action against similarly harmful actors, insofar as it affords these others greater assurance that their disobedience will not be met with jail time. And through the multiplication of action, bought here by loose legal indemnity, climate disobedience are in effect able to reclaim a form of public authority over the agents and practices that are threatening serious public harms. They're trying to open up a pathway here for action to proliferate. Now, that climate activists are thinking in precisely these terms is clear just by looking at the manner and extent to which they've been promoting the use of the necessity defense. The Climate Disobedience Center, for instance, has a webpage called the Climate Necessity Defense, a legal tool for climate activists, which explains, and I quote here directly, although the necessity defense employs the legal system of courts and judges, it is fundamentally a political and organizing strategy that continues the direct action you took in the first place into a new phase. It's a strategy for building movement power. Now, remarking on this strategy, one legal scholar argued that, quote, if courts begin to accept the necessity defense more widely, it will constitute one tool of many that could be used to stop climate change. Unsurprisingly then, the uptake of this legal strategy has been promoted by many groups and networks, including now Extinction Rebellion. They have a necessity defense case guide, and the Civil Liberties Defense Center. With all of this support, use of the defense has exploded in recent years. In the US and UK alone, where it's most active, there were dozens of cases between 2008 and August 2021 on which climate disobedience pled or attempted to plead necessity, and this number grows every year. The Climate Disobedience Center keeps a really good kind of historical record of all these cases. They have a ton of information on this. Now, I can say more about the formal aspects of the necessity defense and what's required for using it later if there's interest. But one point that I want to make here is that climate disobedience are not actually the first to instrumentalize the penal process in this way. In fact, in the 1960s and 70s, necessity pleas were really common among anti-nuclear and anti-war protesters in the United States. So common that there's actually a literature from the 1980s on the political necessity defense. In this sense, climate disobedience does not represent a sui generis break with the consensus view of civil disobedience as a communicative act. Rather, what I want to say is that harm prevention civil disobedience is a broader class of action, which includes but is not limited to climate disobedience. Now, I think in addition to anti-war and anti-nuclear disobedience, perhaps some non-climate related cases of environmental activism, like anti-deforestation disobedience, could fall in here. I also think that probably some instances of animal liberation disobedience, like that from the Animal Liberation Front or direct action everywhere, could qualify. Although I'm not sure if activists in these cases have attempted to argue necessity. Clearly, though, they often understand the ends of their action to be the prevention of harm. these guys, direct action everywhere, take kind of these similar mass number strategies where they'll just walk into factory farms, take the animals out. Okay, now some might think that it's pretty convenient that climate disobedience have a protest strategy that just so happens to get them out of punishment. But I want to stress again that even if the necessity defense achieves this, getting out of jail is not their primary aim. After all, even having the opportunity to plead necessity requires them to expose themselves to serious legal risk and to leave their fates decided by juries and often very unsympathetic judges. And the legal risk is very real. Often enough, they are actually punished, and sometimes for years. This guy, Tim Christopher, he actually leads the Climate Disobedience Center. He's put a lot of information out there about the necessity defense. There was a documentary about him that was better known like 10 years ago. In 2008, he interrupted a Bureau of Land Management sale in Utah, which was later deemed to be an illegal sale of public lands for oil extraction. But despite that, he was sent to jail for 2 years for interrupting an auction. Now, in submitting themselves to public judgment, however, these harm prevention civil disobedient activists are not just exploiting the legal system. I think they're also affirming democratic authority by expressing something like an inverted fidelity to law. And that's not fidelity to the strict letter of legal codes, but instead to the ineliminable element of living human judgment that's contained in the interpretation and application of law. In my mind, I think this further speaks to the civility of their actions. Now, of course, some of you probably have already thought this, successfully arguing necessity requires establishing that one's legal act was in fact necessary for stopping or preventing harm. And this suggests a very powerful objection, which occupies the second half of the paper. Namely, that it is highly implausible, if not altogether incoherent, to claim that any single instance of especially civil disobedience could possibly be necessary for preventing climate harm, at least in any perceptible sense. Person who has this objection in mind might say, look, however noble such actions might be, they're ultimately no more significant than single drops of water in the ocean. Their purpose can only really be to draw attention to the crisis, or more crudely, just to give expression to their moral outrage. It's which is to say, climate disobedience is ultimately just a communicative act. That's the objection. It's not really preventing. Now, this is an important objection because if it's right, then regarding climate disobedience as a genuinely harm preventative act would be misguided, wrong. Now, in responding to this objection, I turn to a surprisingly analogous debate over the significance of individual votes in mass elections. It's a real puzzle among political psychologists. Why do we vote? We're not going to decide the election. Your vote is no more significant than a single drop of water in the ocean. That's actually where that came from. Anthony Downs, 1957. Now, I'll spare you the details here. The argument in that part of the paper is equal parts long and technical, which is to say probably pretty boring. But in broad terms, I argue that so long as a particular act of climate disobedience, one, serves to bring us closer to meeting critical emissions reductions targets, two, so long as the world ultimately succeeds in reaching those targets and therefore averting catastrophe, then three, there is a coherent basis for regarding that particular disobedient act and any like it as having been causally necessary to achieving that end. In other words, so long as we make two reasonable assumptions, first, that climate disobedience's contribution to preventing catastrophic warming, however small it might be, is more than nothing. And two, that catastrophe will in fact be averted, then we can regard the use of the necessity defense in these cases as valid. Again, I can talk more about that if you'd like. And a lot of my argument there just essentially imports some of the responses in the debate over the significance of voting. Just applies it here to the climate case, which I think is really analogous. But there's an important point that we have to note. What I'm saying implies that necessity can only truly be established in retrospect. If we fail to prevent catastrophic warming, then no matter how great or small any particular contribution was to that end, it will not have been necessary. Just like in electoral politics, even if you work really hard to elect a candidate, if that candidate is not ultimately elected, then logically speaking, your efforts will not have been necessary for that candidate being elected. Maybe that's a kind of puzzling way of putting things, but what I'm trying to say is simply that an action can only be necessary for achieving an end if that end is in fact achieved. So we might wonder, what claims of climate, what do claims of necessity hang on now then in the context of climate disobedience? Well, in the paper, I argue that when climate disobedience claim necessity, when they invoke the necessity defense, they're giving expression to what we might call a radical hope. Now, this radical hope, I think, is based on three beliefs. It has three parts. The first is that climate catastrophe can still be averted. Second, while the contribution of individual actions to that end may be imperceptibly small, they're not zero. Finally, that a sufficient number of other people will act before it's too late, such that everyone's efforts will not have been in vain. Now, I think these beliefs are radical for a number of reasons. Take the first one. Given that there's no assurance that we will succeed in preventing climate catastrophe, or really, if we're going to be frank about it, given that there are very good reasons to believe that we will fail at preventing climate catastrophe, any action undertaken today is necessarily shot through with a sense of the tragic. In other words, people who are acting, putting their lives on the line to prevent climate harms, putting their legal futures on the line at least, however they're able, they do this in plain and often painful awareness that all of their efforts could amount to nothing. And again, in the case of climate disobedience, at great personal cost. Now, I bet some of you here today have touched that feeling of, does anything I do matter? Especially with respect to climate change. But if you had that feeling, you still act, you shared that radical hope a little bit. Now, take the second belief. The problem here is perhaps even more intense, especially thoughtful academic types, because I think believing, or at least acting as if we believe that individual action matters, that cuts against the prevailing counterfactual view of causal significance. For this reason, disobedience must always contend with, the appalling questions of, what's the point? What does it matter if you act? What does it matter if you do this? And yet, in the face of those questions, they have to summon the will to carry on. Now, again, I'm sure many of you will know all too well that this question can come from all sides, from friends, from family, from skeptical coworkers, and often enough from our own nagging sense of cosmic insignificance. So continuing to put oneself on the line in the face of such enervating social and self-doubt requires a kind of courage, or at least like idiot stubborn will. Yeah. Now, the final belief, three, I think there's something radical. Belief of faith in undertaking action with the understanding that its significance ultimately depends on a multitude of unknown others acting in kind, and without external incentives of public sanction or censure. Nobody's going to be criticized if they don't join the climate disobedience movement, really. Actually, quite the opposite. often in the face of strong external incentives not to act. After all, virtually any kind of voluntary individual climate action right now carries with it something of sacrifice or risk, at least in the more privileged parts of the world. Be that making uncomfortable lifestyle decisions like going vegan or not flying, or in the case of climate disobedience, banding with others to overtly violate the law. And all the while, the infuriating, slow gait of collective progress can make the siren calls of resignation, despair, and denial that much harder to overcome. And yet, despite the radicality of hope and action in this context, I do believe that we have reason to share it. This becomes clearer when we consider the alternatives that are open to us: flat denial, defeatism, or passivism. Now, denial, of course, is untenable for anyone who understands the problem in a basic empirical sense. Defeatism, advocated by Roy Scranton and his ilk, I truly detest Roy Scranton, effectively amounts to another form of denial, at least so long as it remains possible to act, and there's even a remote chance of averting catastrophe. And of course, both of these forms of denial, brute empirical negation and defeatism, are typically made possible only by the kind of insulating comforts and distance that those with great generational luck residing in the most privileged parts of the world can afford. When your water is running out, when your homeland is being swept out to sea, or when you don't have enough food to feed your family, throwing up your hands and accepting the inevitable, learning how to die, as Roy Scranton so charmingly puts it, loses, I think, its abstract attractiveness. Now, the final alternative, passivism, is incompatible with any reasonable conception of moral duties, be that most religious doctrines, golden rule, utilitarianism, deontology, or virtue ethics. If you know the problem is real, and you know that something can still be done to stop it, what compelling moral reason could you possibly have for not acting? So taken together, these three beliefs, this radical hope, I think endows actions taken today with what we might call presumptive necessity. And of course, perhaps paradoxically, regarding disobedience as presumptively necessary may contribute to it being actually necessary, much in the way that people believing paper money has value makes it have value. For when necessity is formally recognized in the courtroom, which is to say when disobedience plead and are exonerated by appeal to necessity, again, the effect will be to make it more likely that similar actions will be undertaken in the future, and thus that emissions will be reduced more, and perhaps that emissions will be reduced sufficiently, which would, of course, ultimately mean that all such actions will have, in fact, been necessary. It's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, but in a good way. And this is clearly part of what climate disobedience are seeking, to provoke a proliferation of harm prevention, civil disobedience, a cascade of action great enough to prevent catastrophe. So, as always, there is much more to say here, but I think that this is as good of a place as any to stop. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm looking forward to the conversation. Just in case yourself.